Howdy folks, hope you're all having a good one, and welcome back to World of Warships with Rear Admiral Jingles. Today we have Byzantine Blade in a Tier 8 domination battle here on the neighbours map, and he's in the Tier 7 German battleship, although technically it's more of a battle cruiser, the Scharnhorst. I really like this ship, and there's a lot to like, although it does have certain limitations. But when it was first introduced into the game, and it was quite some time ago, this was one of the early premiums to be introduced into the game. I hated it. But I didn't hate it because there's anything actually wrong with the ship. I hated it because I just didn't understand it. You see, the Scharnhorst, as a Tier 7 German battleship slash cruiser, more on that in a bit, it's very similar to the Gneisenau. They're both fast. They're both pretty well armoured. They both have protected citadels. They both have good secondaries. But where the Gneisenau is armed with 6 15-inch guns that couldn't hit the side of a barn from the inside, the Scharnhorst is armed with 9 very accurate but lower caliber 11-inch or 283mm guns. And it was these guns that were causing me problems the first time I took the Scharnhorst out to play. But again, not because there's anything intrinsically wrong with having 11-inch guns on your battleship or battle cruiser. But I just didn't understand things like, because this was a long time ago, but at the time I didn't fully appreciate things like ricochet angles. And I can clearly remember lining up all 9 of these 11-inch guns at a Cleveland, which is just a light cruiser, and at the time the Cleveland was a Tier 6 light cruiser. Yes, really, I know, hard to believe, but it's true. And I'm in a Tier 7 battleship, and I unloaded all 9 of these 11-inch rifles, and all 9 shots just either missed. Most of them hit, but those that hit just ricocheted clean off. And I thought, this is a terrible battleship. I can't even kill a Tier 6 light cruiser. Well, yeah, but the Cleveland has a 100mm armour belt, and it was steeply angled. So, I mean, even a Yamato's 18.1-inch shells are going to ricochet off a 100mm belt if it's sufficiently well angled. But I didn't really appreciate that at the time because I was a massive noob. So I just thought, wow, this ship is terrible. I can't even kill light cruisers in it. There was nothing wrong with the ship. It was all down to me. Since then, however, I have grown to appreciate just how good this ship is. But it does still beg the question, why the comparatively low caliber 11-inch guns when basically every other German battleship from Tier 6 up have at least 15-inch guns, and by the time you get up to Tier 9 and 10, and discounting some of the special ships that have even bigger calibers, but ships like the Frederick the Great and the Grosse Kurfürst have 16-inch guns. And yet the Scharnhorst, which in all other respects is a great ship, has these piddly little 11-inch rifles. Well, there's actually a very good reason for that. And it all stems from the German naval experience in World War I. Prior to World War I, the Germans got into a bit of an arms race with the Royal Navy. The whole thing was kind of doomed to failure from the start because the Royal Navy was always going to be able to outbuild the German Navy. Plus, we had the French as our allies, and the French didn't have a small navy either, but the Kaiser wanted a big navy, so a big navy is what the Kaiser got. What the Kaiser did not get, however, was a navy that, while it was extremely powerful, was not really able to successfully challenge the Royal Navy at sea. So, the German Navy's strategy in World War II was basically to avoid combat with the Royal Navy wherever possible. And in fact, the only major naval engagement of World War I, if you don't count the Battle of the Falklands, which wasn't that major an engagement, but Jutland certainly was. It was a massive fleet action, but it occurred as a result of the German Navy being lured out of their safe ports to attack what they thought was just a light cruiser force. And yet, they still dished out more damage than they took. They scored a tactical victory at Jutland, but a strategic defeat, because they never ventured out to face the Royal Navy again. Because the Royal Navy, even though it took more losses, could sustain those losses. And the German Navy couldn't sustain the losses that it took. Well, World War II rolled around, and the little Austrian corporal was determined not to repeat that mistake. Plus, he couldn't afford to. Building a navy is hideously expensive, especially if you start including battleships and battle cruisers into the mix. Germany still wanted a navy, of course, but due to the limitations of the Treaty of Versailles post-World War I, they just weren't allowed to build that kind of navy again, and they wouldn't have been able to afford it anyway. They still wanted ships, of course, but if you can't afford or are not allowed to build a large fleet, instead what they opted for was to build a smart fleet. And by that, I mean they put the resources they had into where they could get the most bang for their buck. They never even entertained any fantasies of directly being able to challenge the Royal Navy at sea. But the Royal Navy has one big vulnerability, and it's the reason why the Royal Navy existed in the first place. Britain is an island nation, and relied on its navy for imports. And so the Scharnhorst was never built with the idea of challenging Royal Navy battleships. It was built as a commerce raider. It was built to hit Britain where it was going to hurt the most, by attacking its convoys, and armed with 11-inch rifles it could do things like that to the cruisers and destroyers that were escorting those convoys. Ships like the Scharnhorst basically encapsulated the entire concept of the battle cruiser. Armed with guns, able to make short work of cruisers like that, the biggest thing that you would typically find escorting a convoy, and sufficiently well armoured to be able to shrug off the return fire from the cruiser and destroyer escorts, while at the same time being fast enough to easily outrun anything capable of sinking it, like a battleship. And the genius was that Germany didn't need to build a lot of these things. Just the threat of one of these things loose in the Atlantic meant that every convoy would have to be escorted by battleships. Now that didn't mean that you actually had to include battleships in the convoy itself, although in some cases that did happen. The problem there, of course, is that if your battleships are crawling along at the speed of the slowest merchantman in the convoy, that makes them incredibly vulnerable to U-boat attack. So what generally happened was something of a compromise. Oh, I think we're about to see a battle cruiser get deleted. Yep. So yeah, what generally would happen would be something of a compromise. Rather than actually embedding battleships and their escorts inside an actual convoy, instead, large battleship forces with all of their escorts would have to be tied down in the Atlantic close enough to the convoy lanes. Oh, sorry, ignore that, did it again. I really need to stop recording these videos with my email client open. Where were we? Oh yeah. Large battleship forces and all of the escorts that they needed to protect them from the U-boat threat would have to be stationed in the Atlantic at all times in positions where they were close enough to the convoy lanes to be able to respond in case one of these things showed up on the horizon, because it would just utterly maul the cruiser and destroyer escorts, if they even had any cruiser escorts, and then have their wicked way with all of the defenceless merchantmen. And just the threat of one of these things being around was enough, as was the case with the ill-fated convoy PQ-13, as a result of just the rumour of the Tirpitz sailing from its Norwegian fjords caused the Royal Navy to basically panic and order the convoy to scatter, which led to the almost complete destruction of the convoy, and the temporary abandonment of the Arctic convoys delivering supplies to Russia when they needed it the most. And the Tirpitz hadn't even sailed. Just the threat of the Tirpitz sailing was enough. Which of course is why, any time one of these things got out into the Atlantic, as was the case with the Scharnhorst and later with the Bismarck, pretty much the entire Royal Navy would be mobilised to hunt them down and sink them. The threat they posed was that severe. You could argue that building ships like this and the Gneisenau, her sister ship, and ships like the Bismarck and the Tirpitz was a massive waste of time and resources. And tactically, you'd be correct. But strategically, the impact that they had far outweighed any actual damage to shipping that they inflicted, purely because of the threat that they posed. Speaking of actual damage to ships that they inflicted, we're about to have a case of art imitating life. Oh look, HMS Furious, Tier 6 aircraft carrier. So the Furious and her two sister ships, the Courageous and the Glorious, were originally going to be battle cruisers in World War I, but they were converted to aircraft carriers. Now, the Furious herself actually survived World War II and was broken up for scrap in 1948, but her two sister ships weren't so lucky. The Courageous, the lead ship of the class, was sunk by a submarine in 1939, And the Glorious was sunk by the Scharnhorst. And it was sunk while doing the exact opposite of what this Furious is going to do. I don't think this one's going to survive World War II, not by coming out and sailing towards the Scharnhorst. The Scharnhorst, along with its sister ship the Gneisenau and the heavy cruiser the Admiral Hipper and 5 destroyers, came across HMS Glorious and her 2 destroyer escorts, HMS Ardent and HMS Acasta. It was something of a one-sided fight. Ardent and Acasta tried to protect the carrier by laying smoke screens, which resulted in the loss of both the Ardent and the Acasta. But a long-range shot, and I mean like a 25-kilometre range shot from the Scharnhorst, hit the Glorious after the battle had been going for 6 minutes. It started a massive fire, which basically made it impossible for the Glorious to hide. It took slightly longer to sink the Glorious, although she did get sunk, than it took Byzantine Blade here to sink that Furious. So hooray, he sunk the carrier. No more air threat. Yeah, if only that were true. What are you talking about, Jingles? I saw the team list at the start of the battle. There's only one tier 6 carrier on each side. Yeah, but the enemy also have a tier 8 carrier. That thing right there. The Nebraska. Yes, it's a hybrid. Wargaming's latest scheme to sneak even more of everybody's favourite class of ships into the battle while still being able to claim, without actually lying, that the matchmaker rarely gives you double carrier battles anymore. In this battle, things are finally starting to swing around in Byzantine Blade's team's favour. They've been behind for most of this battle. In fact, it wasn't that long ago, they were very far behind. They'd lost 6 ships to the enemy team's 3, and they were trailing by 200 points. They're now finally ahead on points, although not by much, and they have a 1 kill advantage, but the enemy team do have 2 of the cap circles. The Gepard over there is on very low health, and if he's not careful, he's going to die, and the team won't have the points or kill lead anymore. Looks like the Nebraska's just pulled a U-turn. Oh, the Surrey, the team's remaining cruiser, just took a massive hit from somebody, and is probably not going to survive much longer. Also, look at the position of the enemy Z-31. He's making a run for the Serov, the team's only carrier. In fact, I think the Z-31 has just spotted the Gepard. Yep, he's killed the Gepard. The enemy team are now ahead. The kills are even. And the North Carolina is getting into a brawl with both the Nebraska and the Bismarck. Oof. I do not like the look of this. And the Surrey's gone down. Oh, this isn't good. It's here where the North Carolina succumbs to what I can only describe as a sudden and fatal rush of shit to the brain. He did get kind of unlucky in his last armor-piercing salvo into the side of the Nebraska, which didn't kill it. But he's now committing to a ram, as is the Nebraska. The thing is, from the Nebraska's perspective, he's on fire, he's on low health, he's not going to survive anyway. That's actually a good trade. From the North Carolina's perspective, not so much. I mean, on paper, it's even. It's a tier 8 battleship for a tier 8 battleship, which is also a tier 8 carrier. But trading like that is only a good idea if your team's ahead. And you can afford to lose the ship if it means taking out one of the enemy, because you'll still be ahead. The Nebraska could afford to do that, because from his team's perspective, it hasn't actually changed anything. They're still 1 kill and 150 points up. To be sort of fair to the North Carolina, the Nebraska was definitely not going to make it easy for him to dodge that ram, because it made perfect sense for the Nebraska to do it. But the North Carolina wasn't even trying to avoid the ram, he was committing to it too. And when you're losing, it's not a good idea. I mean, the mathematics of the equation is not particularly hard. If you're behind on ships, you do not want to keep trading 1 for 1, because you'll run out of ships before they will. Plus, let's not forget the Nebraska's a hybrid. I mean, the North Carolina is very definitely dead, but you could argue that the Nebraska isn't dead until its dive bombers are too, and they're still up, and they're heading straight for Byzantine Blade. And let's not forget there's also an enemy submarine out here somewhere. The Serov, by the way, clearly capable of thinking and... Oh shit, submarine ping. Yep. Okay, this is going to be a problem. Dive bombers and the submarine. And he's going to have to go through the submarine with all of the problems that entails, while being continuously spotted by the Nebraska's dive bombers in order to try to chase down the Scharnhorst and the Z-31 and take some pressure off the Serov, who is at least capable of thinking and breathing at the same time, because unlike the Furious, who came out to fight a Scharnhorst, he's running the hell away. Now, the Serov was being told in chat by one of his dead teammates, oh, there are the torpedoes. That's fine. He's not pinged anymore. He didn't even need to use the damage control. The torpedoes were launched rather late, and the sonar ping had mitigated itself. Anyway, the Serov was being told in chat to focus the Bismarck and help out Scharnhorst here. I'm not convinced that's a good idea, because the only reason the Bismarck is able to shoot at the Serov is because the Z-31 is spotting him. And sure, the Bismarck is a bigger target and more likely to eat torpedoes, but it's got strong AA and it's a tier 8, and the Serov is only tier 6. So I think, because the Serov is definitely focusing the Z-31, that is probably the smartest idea. And in fact, he is hitting the Z-31. Byzantine Blade also appears to have come to this conclusion because he, when he had the chance at least, was focusing the Z-31 rather than the Bismarck. Although right now he has his own problems because, yeah, submarine. And there's another sonar ping, which has of course revealed the submarine's approximate position. He gets the depth charges away, which are on a pretty short cooldown on this ship. Serov still focusing that Z-31 for all it's worth. Oh, here come the torpedoes. I think he's probably going to eat all three of those, which is going to be a problem. However, the U-69 has screwed up. He's within 2 kilometers, and he's at periscope depth. And Byzantine Blade, knowing that he was hunting a submarine, had the high explosive loaded. The U-69 crash dives, he's lost contact, but he's managed to get another sonar ping off, but I'm pretty sure he's too close for those torpedoes to arm. And, yep, second depth charge attack nails the U-69. That just leaves the Bismarck, because the Serov has succeeded in taking out the Z-31. Because it's an extremely brave destroyer in this game that isn't the USS Kidd and voluntarily chooses to go after an aircraft carrier, but that just leaves the Bismarck. Now, unlike in the North Carolina versus Nebraska incident, this is absolutely the right moment to go for a ram, because the enemy team will be out of ships and you'll still have an aircraft carrier and you'll win. Again, unlike the Nebraska versus North Carolina incident, the Bismarck knows this too, and he's having none of it. The safest option for Byzantine Blade would have been not to expose the side of the ship like that and instead just nose right in and cut the Bismarck in half with the bows of the ship, and you wouldn't have taken the bitch slapping there that he did. But he did survive it, he did get the torpedoes away, and he did get the Kraken unleashed. With 178,000 damage done, as well as the high caliber, the close quarters expert award, I actually missed that one happening, and of course the Confederate. Not bad for a tier 7 battlecruiser on with piddly little 11-inch guns in a tier 8 battle, particularly with 2 aircraft carriers on the enemy team. Commiserations to the enemy Bismarck and the Nebraska, who managed to get more experience on a defeat than all but the top 2 highest scoring members of the winning team. It does always kind of suck when that happens, but extremely well done to Byzantine Blade and the Scharnhorst with 2,600 base experience, an extremely good score. And I hope you all enjoyed watching him achieve it, because that is it for today. As always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.